Welcome everyone. It's so lovely to see you all here for our final keynote presentation. Please come in, take your seats. Feel free to come in and file into these front rows as well. We'd love to have you in the splash zone, so to speak. So we're happy to have you here. It's been a real joy to be at the conference with you all. It's been a few extraordinarily rich days, and as we approach the end of our conference somehow, which was so full of extraordinarily amazing presentations and far more questions than we could possibly answer or engage in just 3 days, we'd like to end our formal keynote presentations with a conversation that's a little more open-ended and oriented to what is next. So this evening, with these esteemed guests, we will be discussing the future of the Catholic imagination, primarily, but not exclusively, in literature, with 3 wonderful contemporary working authors, Ron Hansen, Sally Thomas, and James Matthew Wilson. Each of them has agreed to offer a brief opening salvos in response to the not very hard at all question, what is the future of the Catholic imagination? And then we will proceed to a larger, moderated, but still free-ranging conversation. But let's first meet our interlocutors, with whom I know many in this audience are already quite familiar. Ron Hansen is the author of 9 novels, including The Kid, Mariage in Ecstasy, Desperados, and A Wild Surge of Guilty Passion, 2 short story collections, a children's book, 2 collections of essays, as well as several screenplays. His novel, The Assassination of Jesse James by the Coward Robert Ford, was a finalist for the PEN Faulkner Award and later adapted into the 2007 film of the same name, which starred Brad Pitt and Casey Affleck. Hansen studied at Creighton University, the University of Iowa's Writers' Workshop, and Stanford University, where he held a Wallace Stegner Creative Writing Fellowship. He's received fellowships from the Michigan Society of Fellows, the National Endowment for the Arts, the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, and the Lyndhurst Foundation, and was presented with an award in literature from the American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters. In 2007, Ron was ordained a permanent deacon for the Diocese of San Jose. He and his wife, the novelist Bo Caldwell, now reside in North Bethesda, Maryland, where he is a senior deacon in the Archdiocese of Washington. Welcome, Ron.
Thank you.
We also have with us Sally Thomas, who is a poet and the author of 2 poetry collections, Motherland, as well as Among the Living, which is forthcoming from Able Muse Press. With Michael Maddox, she edited the Paraclete Press anthology, Christian Poetry in America Since 1940, which received the 2023 Book Award in Culture and the Arts from Christianity Today. Her novel, Works of Mercy, was published by Wise Blood Books in 2022, and her short fiction collection, The Black Bird and Other Stories, appeared from the same press just this past August. She has received the J.F. Powers Prize for Short Fiction from Dappled Things magazine, 2 Editor's Choice Awards in Fiction from Relief, a journal of art and faith, and multiple Pushcart Prize nominations in poetry. Her essays and reviews have appeared in First Things, National Review, Plow Quarterly, Public Discourse, Religion and Liberty, and another number of other journals. So welcome to Sally. And last but not least, we have James Matthew Wilson, who is a well-known poet and the Cullen Foundation Chair in English Literature, as well as the founding director of the MFA program in creative writing at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. Some of students in there, yes, that's right, here we go, woo! The author of 14 books, his most recent collection of poems is St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds, which came out with Word on Fire in 2024 and is available for sale in McKenna 204 or 205 It's over there, so check it out. He also has The Strangeness of the Good in 2020, which won the Poetry Book of the Year Award from the Catholic Media Awards. The Dallas Institute of Humanities awarded him the Hyatt Prize in 2017. Memoria College gave him the Parnassus Prize in 2022, and the Conference on Christianity and Literature twice gave him the Lionel Basney Award. In addition to his role at the University of St. Thomas, he serves as poet in residence of the Benedict XVI Institute, scholar in residence of Aquinas College, editor of Colosseum Books, and poetry editor of Modern Age magazine. So we have a brilliant panel with us today, and we're so delighted to have you. So I will ask them to offer remarks, and then we'll begin a conversation. So welcome to James.
I have some general remarks about fiction that we'll present now with the hope that I can be more specific as our panel on the future of the Catholic writing continues. I'll begin with a quotation from the essay Confessions of a Reluctant Catholic by Alice McDermott. In it, she recalls learning to be a writer, which seemed to me from the outset to be an impossible pursuit, one for which I had no preparation or training, or even motive, except for a secret and undeniable urge to do so. She had discovered that fiction made the chaos bearable. Fiction transformed the absurdity of our brief lives by giving context and purpose and significance to every gesture, every desire, every detail. Fiction transformed the meaningless, fleeting stuff of daily life into the necessary components of an enduring work of art. The intuition of the fiction writer is similar to that of the scientist, that the world is governed by rules and patterns that are, by analysis and experiment, detectable, that the hidden mysteries of nature can be interrogated and solved. I've run into people who don't read fiction because they feel it is founded on fabrications and swindles and worthless extenuations of reality. Professional golfer John Daly once complained about the English classes he took in college, where he was forced to read these big, fat books that weren't even true. But for many of us, fiction holds up to the light, fathoms, simplifies, and refines those existential truths that, without such interpretation, seem all too secret, partial, and elusive. And that, of course, is the goal of Catholicism as well. Some writers are agnostic and have as their religion art, but just as many are conscious that the source of their gifts is God and have found thanksgiving, worship, and praise of the Holy Being to be central in their lives and artistic practice. In An American Requiem, God, My Father, and the War That Came Between Us, Catholic writer James Carroll wrote that the very act of storytelling, of arranging memory and invention according to the structure of narrative, is, by definition, holy. And in a later interview, Carroll stated that my notion of narrative informs my faith, and my notion of faith informs my idea of what writing is for. Writing gives form and meaning to our sometimes disorderly existence. It gives the Catholic author the chance for self-disclosure and communion with others, while also giving readers a privileged share in another's inner life that perhaps imperceptibly questions and illuminates our own. Reading attentively, connecting our lives with those of fictional characters, choosing ethically and emotionally just as they do, or in contradistinction to them, we enter the realm of the Spirit, where we simultaneously discover our likeness to others and our difference, our uniqueness. Questioning ourselves and our world, finding in it, for all its coincidence, accidents, and contingencies, a mysterious coherence, we may become aware of a horizon beyond which abides the one who is the creator and the context of our existence. Writing on the Catholic short story master André Dubus, Tobias Wolff noted that in his friend's work, the quotidian and the spiritual don't exist on separate planes, but they infuse each other. His is a non-apologetic sacramental vision of life, in which ordinary things participate in the miraculous, the miraculous in ordinary things. He believes in God and talks to him and doesn't mince words. He is open to mystery, and of all the mysteries, the one that interests him most is the human potential for transcendence. Edifying Christian fiction can have a tendency to attenuate the scandal of the incarnation by circumscribing the sensual or sordid facts of the flesh in order to concentrate on heavenly actions and aspirations. And in doing so, such fiction fails both the mysteries we are informed by our Catholic faith and those mysteries of sin and redemption we perceive in our daily lives. St. John Henry Newman wrote that it is a contradiction in terms to attempt a sinless literature of sinful man. Even in the first days of film, when the Lumiere brothers were glancing around their French neighborhoods for subject matter, the cameramen found out that there was a fascinating and compelling story inside each person, and that cinema could reveal it. A Jesuit friend of mine who teaches religious studies noted that he could evolve a class and a fruitful theological discussion about any film or fiction that sees the fundamental connections between things and honestly considers the human condition in all its faltering and messiness. We usually approach any fiction or film in a spirit of receptivity and openness, expectantly waiting to learn, to be emotionally moved, to view the characters' roles being played out with that concentrated attention on the other that Simone Weil likened to prayer. Intimacy, honesty, and revelation are at the heart of our religious practices. Likewise, intimacy, honesty, and revelation will be critical to the future of the Catholic imagination. We shall need Catholic fiction writers who are, in Flannery O'Connor's phrase, hotly in pursuit of the real. She noted that the chief difference between the novelist who is an Orthodox Christian and the novice who is merely a naturalist is that the Christian novelist lives in a larger universe. He believes that the natural world contains the supernatural. And this doesn't mean that his obligation to portray nature is less. It means it is greater. I've discovered in late night conversations that many of my friends have had profound experiences of God's hand, God's voice, God's solace, God's gentle invitation. But how often are those experiences written about? Yet they are as important, indelible, and real as anything else that happens to us. Catholic writers may principally differ from others in their heightened awareness of the unseen foundation of our existence, and in their unsqueamish and unembarrassed insistence that one is hotly in pursuit of the real, especially when writing about the substance of things hoped for.
I want to talk tonight about conversion and the imagination for two reasons, really. One is that I am in this conversation at all as a convert. That is part of why, if I were not a convert, I don't know what I'd be doing right now, but I probably wouldn't be here. But also because conversion struck me as a useful way to look at the life of the imagination, both on an individual level, the imaginative inner life and work of a given artist in the body of Christ, but also the imagination as a collective thing, a cultural imagination, something that's larger, that transcends the individual. Because I think when we talk about the Catholic imagination, we're talking about both of those things. So this is how I found it useful to think about them. So just quickly, more or less midway through my life's journey, I entered upon what I believed to be the fullness of the Christian faith. I was 40 when one day I woke up to a belief in the real presence. This is the short version, I'm not going to bore you. 42 on my reception into the Catholic Church. Even after a lifetime of church going, and at the very least not actively disbelieving in God, I can say that nothing has changed my life more utterly or profoundly in every conceivable way than that triggering revelation and that act of assent. I'm grateful to the fiction writer Phil Clay in his essay in the most recent issue of Commonweal for reminding me of that famous mid-century British convert Evelyn Waugh and his analogy for the convert experience. In a letter to his friend Edward Sackville West, Waugh says, "Conversion is like stepping across the chimney piece out of a looking-glass world where everything is an absurd caricature into the real world God made." Now, aside from the not inconsequential facts of a different upbringing with its different systems of association and its just plain baggage, I did not grow up in a 13th century village in LA, or anything, aside from, these pesky details of, your biography, the convert does experience, perhaps uniquely, a heightened awareness of this process of becoming aware. As Waugh's analogy suggests, what imposes itself, what the convert actually chooses, is a conviction that reality is something else and something more, and something far more ordered towards a large purpose than he or she might previously have supposed. In Tradition in the Individual Talent, T.S. Eliot describes what happens when a new work enters the literary canon. When this happens, it rearranges relations among all the other works in the canon. This is just one of those images that stayed in my, like I trot it out whenever I get a chance because I love it so much. That whole reordering of relations, nothing is ever lost, but everything is changed in relationship to everything else. So this epiphany that Waugh describes rearranges the entire universe into a new and different set of relations. Again, nothing is necessarily lost, but everything is transformed in relation to everything else. To understand what exactly those relations are and how exactly the whole landscape looks in its proper order makes for the work of a lifetime. We think of conversion as that stark instant of recognition, as when things like scales fall from St. Paul's eyes, and in his renewed sight, everything about him and his relation to the world is different. In that unblinding clarity, he sees the fatal caricature that his old life, like the looking-glass world, has been. But conversion is also implicit in the story of the blind man of Bethsaida in St. Mark's Gospel, the man whose sight grows on him slowly. At the first touch of Jesus, he sees people, but they are like trees walking. Only at the Lord's repeated touch does the man begin to see things as they are. This miracle story occurs to me as a figure for the ongoing process of conversion that follows on some initial flash of life-altering insight. Now, actually, this work of seeing and understanding is not only the work of the convert, as in the person who was outside the church and then is inside, but the life's pursuit really of any believer. Whether or not we've consciously experienced some sudden breaking in of light, our sight, like the blind man's, grows on us slowly by degrees. Because the human person is an integrated complex of body, intellect, and affect, as the new papal encyclical Dilexit Nos identifies as the heart, any human life in pursuit of the clear vision of faith is also a complex, as the Benedictine motto has it, of ora et labora, prayer and work. The work, like the prayer, is a progress towards God, and this is also present in Ignatian spirituality too. As we know, whatever is given to you to do is your work, but it's also your means of continual conversion. So it is for the artist. In a 1955 letter to her then new correspondent, Betty Hester, the mysterious A of the letters in The Habit of Being, Flannery O'Connor elaborates on her own experience as what she terms a born Catholic. She says, "What one has is something given and accepted before it is experienced. I am only slowly coming to experience things that I have all along accepted. I suppose the fullest writing comes from what has been accepted and experienced both, and that I have just not got that far yet all the time. I love that phrase somehow. I have just not got that far yet all the time. That's just marvelous. From a writer's specific version of this striving toward clarity, from this struggle to experience what you've accepted and claim a renewed and clearer vision, the fullest writing comes. But what is this reality we work to see and to which we want our art to bear honest witness? What is it supposed to look like? Often we miss what we're looking for, even when it's sitting right in front of us, because we don't know how to recognize it. Over the last decade and change, I've returned again and again to Dana Gioia's essay, The Catholic Writer Today, to orient myself. It's good to be reminded that that Catholic imaginative writing engages with the world, the real world God made, as Evelyn Waugh says, which doesn't actually exclude the looking glass world of caricature and lie in which fallen human beings all too often believe themselves to operate and whose laws they follow, often to their own destruction. Much fictional and poetic drama turns on precisely that delusion. What raises the delusion to the level of drama is that the writer, him or herself, is equipped to comprehend something that transcends it. In Gioia's words, nature is sacramental, shimmering with signs of sacred things. Indeed, all reality, and I love here the borrowing of Hopkins' language, indeed, all reality is mysteriously charged with the invisible presence of God. In this clearly perceived universe of capacious possibility and radical freedom, suffering is real and terrible, but never meaningless. Evil exists, but does not triumph. Death is the penultimate reality. And even in a looking-glass world, grace is never absent. The challenge is, of course, first to get up every day and believe it all over again, a daunting task in itself, and in itself a good day's work. But the more we make our abode in this large reality, stranger than we think, and full of sometimes jarring epiphanies, the closer we move to that fullest writing that O'Connor describes. In a very great sense, the future of the Catholic imagination depends on the will of the individual artist to do just that. As Joshua Wren writes in his essay, Contemplative Realism, to see clearly requires continual attentiveness, continual self-correction, continual communal reference to the visions of others similarly engaged. Ours must be an exacting examen that ever concludes with great gratitude to God. To this end, we wear W.H. Auden's aphorism like a habit. Among the many qualities required to create or appreciate art of any style or age, the most necessary of all is an unlimited capacity for reverence and repentance. To act well, we must first see well. The new papal encyclical Dilexit Nos speaks further to our capacity to see and know as human beings, but particularly, I think, as artists. This encyclical, whose great subject is the Sacred Heart of Jesus, frames this deep knowing as, in a reflection of that divine image, a function of the heart. But what is meant by the heart? In classical Greek, I'm quoting here, the word cardia denotes the inmost part of human beings, animals, and plants. For Homer, it indicates not only the center of the body, but also the human soul and spirit. The heart appears as the locus of desire and the place where important decisions take shape. In Plato, the heart serves, as it were, to unite the rational and instinctive aspects of the person, since the impulses of both the higher faculties and the passions were thought to pass through the veins that converge in the heart. From ancient times, then, there has been an appreciation of the fact that human beings are not simply a sum of different skills, but a unity of body and soul with a coordinating center that provides a backdrop of meaning and direction to all that a person experiences, end quote. The heart is the interior reality of the human being, the locus of sincerity and of the naked truth about ourselves. Heart is as good a word as any for that part of us that follows Socrates' arguments for the existence of the soul, but also enters that cell with him and his stricken friends, and in participating in that scene in which a man converses serenely about truth claims while waiting for the hemlock course to arrive, knows what is meant by the soul of Socrates. Or that part of us that reads Coleridge's Frost at Midnight, written in the frozen beginning of 1798, the poet's first big year. We may remain skeptical of the early romantic account of reality, but we can't fail to be moved by the love for the sleeping baby, which animates the poem in a way that doesn't negate but transcends its ideas. Just today, the poet and playwright Jane Charles described the historical Francois Rabelais as filthy but generative. His character in her play, Sonner les Matines, is both these things. He is a figure for the imagination, which, as Paul says of Christ in the first chapter of Colossians, holds all things together in itself. I think we can take all of this as a sign of hope and encouragement. The whole point of the heart as a figure, the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and the mysterious part of ourselves that analogizes and reflects the divine furnace of charity, that abyss of all virtues, that desire of the everlasting hills, is that the image of God that we bear uniquely as human beings. In an era in which we grapple with the implications of a rapidly developing industry in artificial intelligence, we do well to remind ourselves that the peculiar dimensionality of human intelligence as a complex of intellect, intuition, and emotion, all of which and more might be summed up in the word imagination, is not replicable by a machine. One last quotation from Dilexit Nos: "Without deep emotion, thought cannot begin, and in this age of artificial intelligence, we cannot forget that poetry and love are necessary to save our humanity." So I'm grateful for this reminder that our human imagination, private and shared, fallen but yearning always for clarity of vision, finds its source in that great heart, that divine imagination, the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, ever ancient and ever new.
I was sort of surprised by this invitation because I think it's a really dangerous thing to ask people who make stuff up for a living to tell you what the future's going to be. I predict that within 5 years, children will come into the kitchen for breakfast, and their mother will not ask them if they brushed their teeth, but if they've recited their Longfellow. That when a child asks his father, what math's good for, after all, I'm not going to use it when I grow up, he'll say, well, you're going to have to count your iambs, aren't you? Right? And when the children are standing out by the bus stop in the cold of the Michigan winter, waiting for the bus to arrive in the morning, they'll be debating whose imagination is more Eucharistic and sacramental, Dana Gioia's or Paul Mariani's. You heard it here first. The future of the Catholic imagination has been imagined and reimagined many times. Many of us here are philosophers and theologians, not writers, and have noted that, that the way in which the Church thinks about the whole of reality has been transformed, has been reimagined many times. I'm thinking, for instance, in the 19th century, when the Church lost its last political claims, and many predicted that the papacy would not survive to the year 1900. And yet, for some reason, in 1870, the Church gathered its bishops for the First Vatican Council, a council that was quickly aborted because of the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War and was never concluded. And yet they still found time to issue Dei Filius and to declare that anyone who denies that God and his creation of the world can be known by reason alone, let him be anathema. a very bold claim for that time or any time. And it's a claim that's probably one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard, because it's a doctrine of faith that you, as a Catholic, have to believe in your reason. It's a doctrine of faith that your reason has the capacity not only to figure out how to open a can of chunky soup, but that it can actually ascend from the soup and the can opener all the way up to the stars and beyond the stars to God himself. And that you can do this on the evidence of reason alone, the nature of reason alone. This was prophetic. This was predicting the future better than the boys at the bus stop. Because what proceeded in the years that followed, and what had indeed already begun a century earlier with the French Revolution, was the beginning of the reduction of reason and thought about the world to ideology. That is to say, increasingly, over the last 2 centuries, the human mind, far from seeking a broader and more complete vision of the world, has sought to enclose itself in its own, in the words of George Orwell, smelly ideologies and smelly orthodoxies and petty ideologies. And so the church declared that every Catholic was obliged to keep his mind open to the fullness of being. And in response to that demand came the revival of the study of Thomas Aquinas, where for happy generations, young men went off to schools like Notre Dame to learn their lockstep Neotomism so that they could explain to you why they knew God existed and how the world made sense, and absorbed all of the new scientific discoveries as if it were nothing compared to metaphysics, because there is nothing compared to metaphysics. And in that same century, with Henri de Lubac and the great ressourcement theologians, there was an even greater deepening, an insistence not only to return to the sources of the fathers and to re-envision the universal church with the eyes of our great ancestors and our fathers, but also to return with them to that fundamental perception of the world as a place ordered by being, by truth, by goodness, and finally and above all, by beauty. Once that vision is recovered, a vision that says to the last property of the real, the mind must be prepared to go, something was done that made it possible. Something had occurred that made it possible for the artists of the modern world to begin to also look with wider eyes and brighter eyes and more perceptive eyes. But of course, the artists had been doing this for a long time. If you want to know what the ressourcement theologians had discovered in the Fathers, you don't have to look very far. You can just go to Chartres Cathedral or to Notre Dame, to any place that's suspended with flying buttresses, as if to say, the cosmos is so capacious, creation is so capacious, that we have to put outside supports on it to keep it from overflowing. To any church that has a rose window that shows us that the whole of reality is present visibly before you in your imagination, but also by the power of your reason, and that the portal that leads you into that place will be surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, saints carved in stone in the hundreds, looking at you and welcoming you into their presence, into the liturgical life, the imagined liturgical life of the church. We also have, of course, that great cathedral of words. I know I could have talked about Thomas Aquinas here, but I'm a poet. So I'm going to talk about Dante, that great cathedral of words that is the Divine Comedy, and the immense cloud of witnesses, the populations of hell, purgatory, and paradise that we find in those pages. I remember as a young man reading that poem for the first time after I had read Milton's Paradise Lost, and I realized what I didn't like about Paradise Lost for all the beauty of the iambic pentameter, and it was that it was underpopulated. You know, with apologies to Dave Bentley Hart, hell is a very interesting place, and some people should stay there. That's Artur Rosman clapping. Okay, so I do think it's the case that when we're talking about the Catholic imagination, we're talking about the ground that is laid by the practice of prayer, by the things that we have built in order to make our prayer possible, and the great thoughts that arise out of prayer in the realms of philosophy and theology. And it's when those things, it's because those things, I should say, were done so well over the course of 2,000 years that it's also been possible for the fine arts to find expression that allows them to join the cloud of witnesses of the philosophers and the theologians, and to be ways in which we become perceptive of the whole of being, ways in which we too say, I will be condemned if I refuse to see reality whole. Now, it's at this point in the comments that the typical contemporary Catholic writer will say, and that's why I'm talking about a small c Catholicism, right? And that's where somebody covers his eyes and says, I got to get out of here. And because we're not talking about small c Catholicism. What holds our eyes open to the whole of reality is not merely a philosophical claim. It's a doctrine of the faith handed down to us by the mystical body of Christ, whose authority comes solely from Christ. And so it's the fact of Christ's incarnation that ultimately obliges us to be perceptive of the full body of the world's body, in the words of John Crowe Ransom. So what would a future of the Catholic literary imagination look like if it had that kind of vision? It's hard to say, and it's kind of frightful to say, because as I've had a chance to say in the last couple days, we're at a very troubled and interesting moment. On the one hand, more books are being sold on Amazon.com than at any period in history, and I don't just mean in the history of Amazon.com, but there are more books, period, than ever before. And yet, government surveys show that more people are reading poetry than have been in a very long time, although I'm wondering what they're reading. But in many respects, as the Atlantic Monthly showed some of us a few weeks ago, we're in a post-literate age where people are increasingly closed off to the chief sources and fonts of culture that have sustained people across the millennia. In the 1980s, it was popular to repeat the cant, C-A-N-T, of Jacques Derrida, that we have to get people away from being logocentric, centered on the word. But that would be the death of humanity, because there were entire centuries in the last 2,000 years where our civilization actually survived merely in words copied down in manuscripts in various monasteries, and we're the beneficiaries, we're the living fruits of what was at one point just an artifact of culture, but an artifact that was a seed that was able to bear fruit when it was read and rediscovered and to come alive thereafter. So what could the future look like? Well, I think at least three things. First, then here I have to share a brief memory. When I first aspired to be a writer as a student at the University of Michigan in the 1990s, and I met a few dubious characters who also liked to write, and we started getting together every week to critique each other's stories and hurt each other's feelings, there were only two things we agreed on. One was that craft mattered, that the construction of the word on the page and the sounding of those words in the air were what really mattered, and that's what we were there to perfect. But we were there to perfect that incarnate reality precisely because an encounter with it could change your life. And so it's my hope, and thankfully, since I'm teaching 100 people to be writers right now, it's going to be my project to make sure that this revival of craft, of a sense of the importance of the well-made thing, and that's well-made by people standards, not Rothko's, that was supposed to be funny. Okay, will actually be recovered in our age. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and in some ways more fundamental, is this. Our oldest literature, and there are several candidates for this, but I think our oldest literature that we think of as genuinely literary are of two kinds. The ancient epics, of course, but I think even more than that, the staged tragedies of ancient Athens. So in one sense, our first literature was just the story of suffering. And alongside that, of course, are the Psalms, the poetry of praise. And it's intrinsic to virtually any literary enterprise that it begin on the slaughterhouse floor of suffering. That's where we begin. And the limitation of the ancient tragedies, as even Plato seemed to recognize, where he's always making fun of them, everything's doom and gloom, it's like, go give a chicken to Asclepius, as even Plato seemed to recognize, there's so much truth in the ancient tragedies because life does contain suffering. In fact, for some of us, it's mostly suffering. But that's still a narrow horizon that the ancient tragic stage offered us. And so what the eyes of the Catholic imagination, with their openness to being, propose, is that while the literary imagination, at least, begins in suffering, it can move the walls of the horizon, to mix metaphors, out to give them greater compass. It can move them out from suffering to praise, to be sure, but then also, as Dostoevsky showed us, they can even bring us from sin and suffering to redemption. And still greater, as Dante showed us, the horizon of the artist's vision can even extend to the perception of God, which means that literature can become a source of the knowledge of reality, not just to the extent of the human experience, that existential experience of misery, suffering, and death, but can also, even in however faint a way, be a vision and a foretaste of heaven and the divine. And so what I hope for the future of the Catholic imagination is that it will continue to do something that writers like Flannery O'Connor and Walker Percy did very well. I hope it will continue to depict the lost and the wandering who feel a hole in the center of their being and are looking for what will fill it. And since leaks won't do it, as Pascal says, they might eventually find God. But I'm also hoping that we can foster and that we will see realized in the years ahead a Catholic literary imagination, a Catholic artistic imagination that, like the Gothic cathedrals of the Middle Ages, is open to the whole horizon of being and is capable of giving to us again, for instance, a language of devotion that's worthy of the praise of God, that's capable of entering into the deeper depths of the spiritual and the religious life, one that's capable of representing the material world not just as an abyss in which somewhere God must be hidden, but as the ordered cosmos that we all know it to be, because otherwise we couldn't talk about anything. I'm hoping to see that kind of vision renewed. So in brief, what we need is another, no doubt, very different Dante.
Thank you all so much. It strikes me just listening to you all and thinking about what we've done over the past few days, that there's, we've sort of skipped over the preliminaries. Here we are talking about the future of the Catholic imagination. And in some respects, I think what we mean when we say Catholic and what we mean when we say imagination might still be a bit underdetermined. And so, I mean, just listening to these comments here, which were so rich, you wonder, do we think of imagination primarily as a faculty of the mind? Or is it, as Sally brought it, is it more a faculty of this heart, especially in the new encyclical? I mean, you spoke so compellingly, Sally, about this inmost part of body and soul, which is drawn near to the divine furnace of charity. And you think about the prophet Jeremiah, it is shut up in my bones and it has to come out. And so is it a property of the eye? Is it a property or a faculty of the senses, of the ear? I don't know that I have the answer to all of these questions here, but I did hear, I think, that it is maybe fundamentally has something to do with desire and the fundamental structures of desire. Like even, James, as you were talking, this kind of ultimate futurity, right? I mean, what is the future? When we speak of future, we might go like full-blown eschatological and think like this sort of union with God. As David Jones says, the fact that we make symbols and signs means that we have some part in a without-endedness, right? It's this gorgeous way of thinking. So I wonder, I mean, that's kind of a heavy question to begin. I mean, but I do wonder, this way, even as Judith was talking last night, right? This sort of difference that we see, the difference between this and this, bridging this difference. It seems to me there is something ecstatic, like living outside the self, putting an expression of something, giving voice to it, giving body to it, giving the perfect sentence, the perfect rhyme, the perfect form. It seems like imagination is always trying to bridge these kind of eschatological gaps until we are all made new. And I wonder if you might, is that this function of desire, how does that fit in, do you think, with imagination and even maybe the practice of writing yourself? I mean, I think when I write my own things, which are more academic typically, but sometimes creatively, there's a sense of orienting oneself to I know not what, but when it comes, you recognize it, right? So there's this sense of orienting oneself to some metaphysical future that is gift and all being. So I don't know. That's that I guess is my first kind of query based on some of the things.
A quotation from James Merrill, a poet, and he was asked about beginning to write something and what was that all about? And he said, I just remember wanting to write a poem.
Yes, right.
And it wasn't a subject, it was just the writing.
Right. Yeah. I think if you start with the big vision, you'll just be paralyzed. And as James was talking about craft, I mean, for a poet and for a fiction writer too, I mean, it really begins with, like your primary desire is for the meter to work in the line, or for the sentence to carry you forward to something. I mean, somebody asked me not too long ago, like, what is your fiction writing process? And I said, well, I write a sentence, and then I write another sentence, and eventually I get somewhere. And, and so, yeah, I mean, as you were talking about desire, I thought, certainly for the artists, and I'm sure visual artists and musicians and people working in all kinds of media have, analogs for this, but that, your first desire is something that's really just primary and craft oriented, that you have a problem that you want to make work. This rhyme scheme, how am I going to make this work? You set up some kind of intricate pattern that's really hard. And what keeps you going is trying to solve the pattern. And only later do you start to see, something else emerges from the pattern and you can kind of move on to what is it that I'm actually wanting in this? Or what does this thing actually want in itself? But I mean, that to me, that's how it starts.
If Plato's right, which I'm sure he is, that eros is the start of all desire, and eros is our desire, and it moves towards what is absolute, the eternal beauty. Along that road, which takes a few miles, one of the things people do is to try to order themselves to what is ultimate, and that's, I think, why Horace says in the Ars Poetica, he says that the poets were the first to make laws and ceremonies and rites. And you would think, what, this is just going to get P.B. Shelley all excited that he thinks he's a priest. What he's onto is that the poets were the first ones to start putting language into meter, and so it's the prototypical order that then leads to the order of law and politics, society, religious right, marriage, and so on and so forth. And Plato talks about that elsewhere in the Laws, where he says, people talk about the Republic and poetry and philosophy. The best place to talk about poetry and Plato is in the Laws, because he says young people are just jumping around randomly, it's like they're on pogo sticks. But if you give them a meter, if you give them rhythm and melody, then they'll do it in an orderly fashion. And there's the whole mystery of what the arts are, because they're artificial, that's in the name, but we're already doing the things that lead towards them naturally. And then when we start making art, it's where these natural impulses that were already in us are being brought to order, and they're not being brought to order as if we're going to civilize ourselves to death. They're being brought to order so that what we do naturally can actually come to a fruitful end. And so it's through that process of bringing the world to order, creating an aesthetic order in the work of art, and again in politics and all that stuff too, but that we're actually ordering our desires to what is ultimate. That's why it's misguided to say, for instance, that as the Jansenists did in the 17th century to poor Racine, that that playwriting and poetry were a waste of time, because they were actually preparations for the life of devotion and giving oneself to Christ.
So this is a completely unfair question to ask a bunch of writers, but Kenneth Woodward and I were talking at dinner, and we were sort of lamenting that that Catholic art and Catholic fiction has sort of receded or retreated from its once prominent position in the public square, right? So we're not, there's not a lot of Catholic fiction that's getting featured in the New Yorker or that kind of thing. So, so if you think that's true, do you have a sense? If it's not writing, or do you think it is? If it's poetry, is it film? Is it art? Is there some other form, when you think about the Catholic imagination and the future of the Catholic imagination, that might be best suited? What can you prognosticate about what would appeal to the sort of base of readership or viewership? How ought we think about the Catholic imagination, maybe creatively, without abandoning the forms that we all love? So, are there other forms that you think might be welcome into this public fora?
I mean, there might be, but I'm not sure I'm interested in them. I mean, that's one answer.
I think film is going to be
film. Yeah,
more
let's talk
important.
about film. Yeah.
Okay.
A good novel might sell 20,000 copies, and that would be a very low attendance for any film. You're always going to have 200,000 people at least seeing a film. So if you want to have a wide disposition of ideas, film is much better as a way of conveying it, I think. Unfortunately, it's very expensive.
Right.
Yeah, the mass culture, real culture divide is kind of hard to think about. I mean, not that film is necessarily mass culture, because I love film, and we have some great film being made now. I'm still, Thomas Miras notwithstanding, still really love The Chosen, for instance, and impressed by what that's doing. And there's Thomas Miras. He's sitting next to Artur Rosman.
Peanut gallery.
Yes. But the first part of your question is the one that I'm concerning myself more because that concerns me more because as I said in my initial remarks, although I didn't quite finish. Well, I did finish this. That there are certain non-malleable aspects to human life, and one of them, strangely, is the capacity to read a book. So, as wonderful as film is, and I love film, I'll happily, next year I'm going to come and give a paper on John Ford, Westerns. But there are some things it doesn't do. Reading is too deeply tied to the formation of the soul, Derrida notwithstanding again, that to ever be untethered. And so if you can't read, you're just going to be a different kind of person and a poorer one. So my concern has been more with recognizing that the Catholic Church within the modern West is the equivalent of the underground church in China to the Patriotic Association. That most of what we're going to be doing is, as Ralph Ellison put it, it's down on the lower frequencies, and that we're currently trying to rebuild a subculture in hopes that someday it will actually simply be a culture. But that's, that depresses me, but it's also the only thing to do.
One of the advantages that fiction or reading has over movies is that you're totally passive in a movie theater. The actors are all playing their parts. The script has already been determined, the cinematography and all that stuff, and you're not contributing to it at all. You're just a receptive person. In fiction, you become the co-creator of the novel. You read a sentence and that reminds you of something else, or a way a person is described has a fullness for you that it wouldn't necessarily have for others. And when I was writing Marriott in Ecstasy, I purposely made it elliptical so that the reader fills in the blanks and tells a different story that I intended to tell. But that's my pitch for fiction.
I agree. I mean, I keep thinking of this, it's a line, I'm going to get it wrong, but that Rowan Williams talked about reading these long novels as an exercise in polyphony and time-taking. And I love the way he put that, because, I mean, when you think when you're really immersed in this kind of long form, and you sort of like begin to think like the author thinks, and the language starts to sort of echo in your head the way, their style, and that just doesn't really happen with a movie. I'm thinking too of another encyclical from Pope Francis on the role of literature and formation, which came out very, very recently as well, and he says that literature is listening to another person's voice, right? So that, I mean, you can do that in movies too, but maybe in a less immersive way. So I wonder if we might kind of reflect together, if we're thinking about the future of Catholic imagination and whatever form it takes, or whatever expression it takes, what role do you think the Catholic imagination ought to have in elevating the ethical and the moral, right? I mean, so if this very empathetic exercise in listening to another person's voice. I mean, even, I might go as far to suggest or ask, is there an element of that when you are writing, right? I mean, you are obviously listening to your voice, but I think there's certainly an aspect of listening to another, maybe divine voice when you write. I wonder if that's, we might reflect a little bit about that.
Yeah, I've likened the writing process to prayer. That you start out with one conception of what you're going to say, and then something new comes up, and especially in terms of metaphor, right? Like, how did I think of that? And it comes from outside of yourself, and that's true of poetry, I'm sure.
Yeah. Right. Well, I think too, in fiction writing, about the way that, when you're writing, you sort of, I think of it as being like theater, and for the actor, the way that you enter into a character and you enter into that character's interior life, and you are basically thinking that character's thoughts. Maybe they're thinking your thoughts for you, but at the same time, at some point, you do. I mean, like there's got to be a limit to that empathy for you as the writer, because you have to have enough distance to know what that character is doing when the character, it's like we all learn in high school about dramatic irony. You have to have a view of the character that the character doesn't necessarily have of himself. And, and so in that kind of space between your consciousness and the character's consciousness that you're constructing, you can see like the moral implications of the things that the character is doing or thinking, that being delusional about something and how that's going to play out. So, you always, in one sense, that's what I think about when I think about apprehending reality as an artist, that your vision always has to be bigger than the vision of the speaker of your poem sometimes. But really, fictional characters, I think, work this way, that you're simultaneously close to them, but you also have a view that they don't, and that has a moral element.
So, in the ancient world, and I think they were right about this, so I think this is true to us today, even though we might not think in these terms. But in the ancient world, the arts were ranked in terms of their relative quantity of narrative content. The more narrative, the higher the art form. So the epic was the great work of art, the stage tragedies, then down below that, lyric poetry, and then the plastic arts, the visual arts. And music occupied a kind of ambivalent place because it was usually accompanying these things rather than separate from them. And that's a clue to one of the things that is valuable about the arts, that the capacity to represent stories, to reveal plot forms, is one of the chief ways in which all the arts, but especially the novel, the drama, and the story, are able to reveal the real to us. It's because we're perceiving a dimension of reality, the laws of reality, that's being revealed through plot form, as opposed to other kinds of forms. But there are other kinds of forms, and I think that's both the joy and the challenge of the poet, is that while poems often are narrative, and they often have narrative content, they also often get to go off into areas that the fiction writer can only enter at the danger of losing his audience. And in fact, the classic moment where this was revealed is again in Plato. I'm going to mention Plato again, but in the Phaedrus, where Plato subsequently will tell us that poets are sixth-rate human beings, just one rank above used car salesmen. But before he said that, before he said insulted poets, he in fact, that statement comes in the middle of him launching on his own poem, his Socrates' great Palinode in the Phaedrus. And at the beginning of the Palinode, as a few people in this audience will know really well, Socrates says to Phaedrus, "Well, it would take a god and a long time for me to define the soul for you. But I can give you a picture. It's a chariot with a man, 2 horses with wings, one very obedient, one refractory. We're done." What is that? That's a poetic image. That's a myth given in an instant. And this is the first moment in all of history where lyric poetry actually realized its potential. That is to say, to manifest by way of figures of speech, by way of metaphor, truths that had never been spoken in the world before. What is the nature of the soul? And as Socrates goes on to describe, what is the nature of the cosmos and the order of human life? So why am I going on like this? Because on the one hand, there's something intrinsically moral about fiction. John Gardner's book, Moral Fiction, is one of the classics of literary criticism. Plot form reveals human action reveals character. Anytime we encounter a human being, a character, we're talking in the terms of good and evil. But one thing to remember, especially as Catholics, is that that's not the limit of the imagination. The moral imagination is not the limit of the imagination. It's the metaphysical imagination. It's the capacity to perceive being. And in fact, if we lose that, we will very soon find it also very difficult to be moral.
So as we're kind of coming to an end of this kind of formal conversation, I wonder if I could just ask one final, pretty simple question. And that is, as we're thinking about the future together of the Catholic imagination, is there anything that gives you hope? Like, how do you hope? What do you hope for? What are the grounds of your hoping? I mean, this is a pretty good start.
I was remembering hearing Carlos Fuentes talk about how easy it was to be a writer in Mexico because he didn't have a long series of books he should have read. But he said, I don't know how anybody, having read Moby Dick, can go out and write a novel again because it seems so all-encompassing. And I think that what gives me hope is that we still endeavor to do that, that we forget about all the reasons we shouldn't be doing it, and we go ahead and do it anyway, and we, often without any hope of selling anything. It's just the act of writing itself is very pleasant, and I think that's always going to be true.
It wasn't that long ago that it wasn't possible to have an intelligent discussion about literature in public without it boiling down to identity politics or something subcretinous like that. Now you can actually talk with people about literature and the arts and on the criterion of is it beautiful or not. Not everywhere, but more than you could 5 years ago. And I think that's a sign of we're in a transitional point in our culture where a few things that have had easy sledding for a few years are going away, or at least being called into question, and people are starting to read good books again and talk about them as if they were good.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, and I think too that, again, to me, just, like I'm late to every party, but, the revelation to me of the way that conversation can be integrated. Angela Alima O'Donnell had an essay recently on the history of Catholic literary studies, which, having not really been in academia, that's a conversation I hadn't followed. But, I was really struck by, that it had been sort of revolutionary and maybe even threatening to talk about integrating conversation about literature, the literary conversation with the theological conversation. And I can remember being in graduate school 30 years ago and just thinking I didn't know what to do with these disparate parts of my life at all. They just didn't seem to go together. And to me, just that actually all of this is one conversation is exciting. And, again, I'm late to the party, so I'm still excited about it. And coming out of, my youngest children are seniors in college, but, I have many friends here who are still, balancing things with very active motherhood. And again, in my own experience as a young mother in the early 1990s, there was being a writer, and then there was, we'll try not to be a mother. And, and this is another thing that, again, is still exciting to me about Catholicism, these years later, just that somehow everything about your life can be integrated and doesn't have to be excluded from your literary concerns, your life as an artist. You don't have, your life doesn't have to be a Venn diagram of a bunch of completely disconnected circles like planets that never touch, that actually can be a big circle with everything in it. And that is exciting to me.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's a lovely image to end on. And I think these last few days have been such a gift to me. We've celebrated all of that, the sort of integration of all of the things that you're talking about. We've celebrated the sentence and the word and the rhyme and the movie scene, and we've celebrated your own creative writing as well as the history of art and aesthetics. We've celebrated Dante and Hopkins and so many lovely things while we are embodied here together as a community of friends, and those friendships I think are only deepening. And so I think that's what the Catholic imagination kind of brings us together. It does have that integrative potential that you're talking about, mind and body and soul, but also in this communal way where all of us are here together to relish the gifts of the Catholic imagination. So it's been a real gift to be with you all, and thank you for your wonderful comments. Friends, would you join me in thanking our panelists? All right, friends, we are just about at the end of this wonderful conference. But before we go, I do have a few thank yous, as well as a special announcement in lieu of a formal question and answer period now. So first of all, I'd really, from the very bottom of my heart, like to thank all the event and AV and catering and janitorial staff who have kept our conference running. I would also like to thank a very special thank you to Amber Kirk and Angela Leachman and their teams who have, from behind the scenes, helped us to pull off yet another wonderful conference. I'd love to thank our friends at the Catholic Imagination Conference for this really wonderful and unprecedented opportunity for us to work together, especially to Dana Joya and Michael Murphy for helping facilitate this collaboration. I would also like to offer 1,000 infinite, to the nth degree, thank yous to my dedicated staff for their very diligent work in putting on this conference, especially Catherine Harvey, Brooke Tranton, especially Justin Patricic, who's back there, for all their hard work. They make it look so easy and so effortless, but you know it is a tremendous amount of work and effort to pull together hundreds of presenters into this coherent and even very beautiful program, to organize all the registrations, to keep the golf carts running, to keep all the logistical things running smoothly, and I would love to give a round of applause to the staff. So we will begin our reception here in a moment, but I do want to remind everybody that we are in for a special treat tonight. Colin Cutler and the Hot Pepper Jam will be performing their Flannery O'Connor and Dante themed set at Legends, beginning at 10 p.m. tonight. This will be our last event of the conference. You are all welcome, and I know there's some of you in our midst who are going to be tempted to call it a night after a long day. But having seen Colin and the band perform more than once, I will tell you now that would be a big mistake. Critics have called his work a celebration of literature and music that accentuates the best in both. Plus, the clocks change tonight, so you get an extra hour for your tomfoolery. So I think we can all make it over there. Woo! And my final announcement is about next year's fall conference. While our dates are still being confirmed because we worship the God called football and we have to wait for their schedule first, the staff and I did want to announce the theme of our 25th fall conference, which is next year, our 25th anniversary fall conference. So now just thinking about, for a quarter of a century, we've had scholars and practitioners and vintners and filmmakers and poets and lawyers and artists and students all gathering together on our campus for really high-level collaborations from very different fields, as diverse as philosophy, theology, political theory, law, history, economics, social sciences, biosciences, literature, and the arts. Thinking back, we have considered such broad themes as life and death, human freedom, the nature of a Catholic university, education, beauty, human flourishing, the role of the state, modernity, friendship, personhood, justice, the body, poverty, and now the Catholic imagination. But we think such an occasion as the 25th anniversary requires a posture that is at once retrospective, looking backward, but also, and perhaps more importantly, decisively oriented toward the future, as the rich heritage of the past gets faithfully reread, received, and reinterpreted by new generations. So our theme for the 25th Fall Conference will thus be living tradition. We will be inviting scholars, practitioners, and artists from diverse fields of study to consider how the phenomenon of living tradition, that gerund is supposed to be ambiguous, living tradition, whether dogmatic, religious, literary, artistic, legal, interpretive, or otherwise, serves to bridge past and future. I hope you will all consider submitting a proposal when the time comes. So we are looking forward to seeing many of you here again next year. We are so beyond grateful for another wonderful conference together. Thank you, friends.